Hello there, and welcome to Anonsee Presents Trans Stories. I'm your host, Anonsee Matrix, and I'm so happy to have you here for our first episode. This is a reoccurring series where we'll be interviewing trans folks on their experiences, careers, and passions. I can't wait to tell the myriad of stories that we have for you. Well, without further ado, we would like to introduce you to our guest for today, Johannes Evans.
Hi, my name is Johannes T. Evans. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a fantasy author. I also write historical fiction, some romance, some erotica, and I also do some media commentary and media analysis as well. So, big mix, multimedia, but it's all, nonsense.
Perfect. So we'll dive right in. Our first question is, how long have you been out for, and what was the process of coming out like for you?
So I think I initially came out when I was about 8 years old, where I was just sort of like, I think I'm a boy. And then the response was just sort of immediately, we should take you to a doctor. And I was quite a sickly child, already had some medical trauma, and was immediately like, no, absolutely not, it's fine. So then I just sort of bit that down. And then I think I came out again when I was about 14, 15. I think I used the non-binary or gender fluid label initially, and then I later came out as a trans man. So yeah, since I was about 15, I'm 25 now, going to be 26 on May 30th. I think the process was different at different times. I think when I initially came out 14, 15, I was quite lucky to go to a school where there were a lot of other queer people out. So subsequently, I don't think that... Not that there weren't homophobic attitudes, because, this was 2008, 2009. It was just the fact that people couldn't really bully everybody because there were so many of us out. I think I had an alright time of it, and then as I've reached certain transition milestones, I only started testosterone a few years ago, I've experienced better things and felt better in myself, but in general I tend to say I was quite lucky.
I'm really glad that you had such an overall positive experience. So, about how long have you been writing for?
I've been writing, I would say, since I was about 8 years old. I think there's a book somewhere that's about an exploding crocodile. That's a pop-up book that I did when I was 8. It's obviously, an 8-year-old's work. But, since I was a young child, I was sort of writing actively. Once I was about 12 or 13, I was writing constantly, and it's very much been an autistic special interest for me. Once I came to be about 15, 16, 17, I started sort of branching out more from writing fan fiction and started writing some original stuff as well. I think I made my first forays into writing professionally when I was 18 or 19, but it didn't really go anywhere. My first book, Heart of Stone, which is a historical romance fantasy with vampires in the 1700s, I published that in 2020. Now, I'd been writing a few pieces of short fiction online before then, but I would say that was my biggest foray into writing professionally. And obviously, I've become a full-time author since then.
I love that so much, and I would absolutely love to see any pictures of your pop-up book after this, if you have any. With the writing that you've done so far, how much has being trans influenced your writing?
Significantly. There are so many themes that I write about, I think, that are heavily influenced by my being transgender, and I think that some of them are really obvious for cisgender people to understand. The way that I write about queerness, the way that I write literal transgender characters, a lot of my feelings around queering gender or commentaries on different ideas of masculinity, especially in different cultures, in different eras. For trans people, particularly trans masks, although I know that the lines between trans femininity and trans masculinity and other different forms of transness, we all sort of play with similar themes from slightly different perspectives, but body horror is obviously one that I play with a lot. I write a lot of pregnancy as horror or pregnancy equivalents as horror. When I write erotica, a lot of belly bulging and oviposition and freaky erotica shit that is ultimately based in the invasion of a body and the physical transformation of it, which is obviously it's a big trans theme, but it's also a really big dysphoria thing. A lot of fear and anxiety around pregnancy, especially as a non-consensual threat of body horror. I've also done like body hopping, body horror, like the idea of like your body being stolen from you or otherwise controlled by an outside party, which I think is a big trans theme. I think another thing for me that I write constantly about that I think cisgender people don't necessarily realize as a trans theme. Ideas of like multiplicity of identity. So not literally necessarily writing like DID or like people having like I know that phrase is bad, multiple personalities, but specifically like the idea of layered selves and the multiple self. So obviously you have things like code switching and the ways that we change our demeanors and our personalities slightly from community to community, especially in a closed community versus an open one, but also things like your perception changing you. When I write about godhood and divinity, the idea that other people's thoughts of you and their beliefs of you literally change who and what you are, but only to a certain extent. A lot of these fantastical concepts, I think, are heavily influenced by my experiences as a trans man and as a gay man, because obviously, like, I experience that on my day-to-day in a way that cisgender people do, but they may not be cognizant of it in the same way, or may not self-examine about it in the same way that we do and that I do.
That completely tracks with my experience as well, because like with my experience in the trans community, who I am and what I do is largely shaped by the viewpoints that others take of me. Because like you'll see in a lot of my sex work, etc., that I position myself as a goddess, and that has kind of created a feedback loop where people continually refer to me as goddess, and it kind of creates this divine self-actualization of, oh, well, they are just a goddess, TM. But also, for me at least, the process of that creating divinity is also formed in the reclamation of having so much power taken away from me as a Black woman, as a trans femme, as being disabled, and having a way to reclaim all of that so that I have that power once again and that others are giving that power to me. So that is kind of how my experience tracks similarly, especially along the lines of talking about divinity and godhood in trans themes. So to kind of follow up from that, I would really like to know how you feel that being trans like affects your experience as an author, or like how accepting of trans folks you feel the genres that you mainly write in are.
I obviously write heavily in the romance genres. Now, I think that my experience is definitely tempered by the fact that I tend to write short stories, and because those short stories are published online rather than being published as books, they have a slightly different community than a lot of people who only read books. Neither of the communities are like better or worse than the other, but they are different, and especially there's age differences and general differences between them, especially because like the people that read my short stories do tend to read more online. I would say that the response to a lot of my trans characters and queer characters is incredibly positive, and I think that a lot of the time what I receive from people is a sense of enthusiasm and excitement, basically at sort of seeing themselves represented in different ways, and seeing characters that they actually relate to, whereas like a lot of traditional romance they might not, because it's so straight and because it's so based in like ideas of like binary gender that don't really leave space for transgender people, let alone other kinds of queer people. With that said, it's interesting sometimes talking in like broader spaces about the romance genre. Romance is obviously treated with, I mean, just a lot of disdain by a lot of mainstream readers and authors because it's seen as like a girls' genre and whatever, and there's a lot of misogyny baked into that. I also find that frequently, like a lot of my work is miscategorized as YA because of the assumption that like, oh well, if it's queer or diverse in any way, then it must be for young adults. Where my work is not in the YA genre remotely. It's very much for adults only as a rule. Writing horror and exploring those genres has been interesting because I would say that like while queer writers and queer and trans people and other marginalized communities, whether they be disabled, whether they be people of color, whether they be marginalized for religious reasons. We often do the best work in these genres because we do the self-examination that cishet people are frightened to do or just bad at doing. A lot of the time, what they do when creating horrors, they tend to just sort of like replicate their bigotries and anxieties. Whereas it's not that we're not capable of doing that. Obviously, we are, but because we tend to identify more with like the monster, or at least society's responses to the monster, I would say that we tend to respond to these prompts and ideas and the fears that are in the horror genre, as well as like sci-fi and fantasy horror, in different ways. Some people who are not members of these marginalized communities, get snippy about that because they understand that they are producing subpar work compared to us. But but the thing is that, like, a lot of bigotry is based into the horror genre, and I would say that marginalized people are almost always on the precipice and are creating the most interesting and the most groundbreaking versions of horror that there are. And I would say that we do the same in romance. The fact that there's attitudes against us, especially in more traditionally publishing spaces, is always going to be the case, because those audiences those products are being, I hate calling it a book a product, sorry. Those works are intended for like the widest possible appeal in terms of audience, whereas the work that's created by marginalized people is expected to be for marginalized audiences. And whether that's morally correct or not, subsequently we're allowed more leeway to play with. And subsequently we're allowed more understanding by members of our community, whereas outsiders, I think, might still engage with it and might still love it. Like, I have a lot of like cisgender and straight readers that really like my work, but like the mainstream appeal is not going to be found there necessarily. And if it is there, it's really difficult to then market to the mainstream. The bigotry is just so baked in, and is so based in fear of the unknown, which is what we are, just by not being the same as the mainstream.
Oh, there's so many different themes here that I want to touch on. I'm going to start with the fact that with other authors I've spoken to, especially like for one example, Maya Dean, I feel like a lot of trans folks do get their stuff lumped into YA for no apparent reason, no matter how, other than the whole, oh, this is queer, this must be YA appropriate, despite everything about it not being YA appropriate. And that is just something that is infinitely funny to me. I realize that I'm not an author. I have a bit more leeway to laugh about it. And I have definitely noticed that the more like marginalized, especially further marginalized people, tend to create significantly better products on average. Again, products, whatever, out of any form of media. Whether that is the media that is writing, whether that is filmmaking or music, it just tends to be more in our wheelhouse for the reasons that you mentioned. I also feel that as marginalized people, we have a bit more leeway in order to make things scarier within the horror genre by being able to leverage a lot of those concerns that we have and make it work in order to make it scarier and more effective for people within our own community. This is not a trans or queer example, but my experience with Get Out by Jordan Peele was going to see it, wasn't opening weekend, was like the weekend after it opened in Montana, which is 89% white, where I grew up. And I went with one of my only other black friends that knew, and we went in, we get all the way to the back, we end up in the absolute center. We are the only people of color of any kind in the audience as we watch everyone filter in, and it is a packed theater. So we end up watching this whole movie and getting progressively more and more scared, not just because of the movie, although the movie was phenomenal when it came to the fear portions of things. However, every time there was something that scared us on a cultural level, we would end up hearing all the white folks around us laughing at it and giggling at it. And it just made it progressively more and more scarier for us, because there's things that are absolutely terrifying to us, that there's just laughter from real people around us, and they're treating this movie almost like a comedy. Up until the end, where it's been out for ages, this is not spoilers. Up until the very end, where the cop car shows up, and me and my friend are basically like, oh, yeah, no, this is not ending well for him. And a cheer goes up in the theater, and we're just sitting there like, oh no, we need to get the fuck out of here. Like, this is not somewhere that is safe for us. It hasn't been this whole time, but this is kind of the breaking point, but we also can't get out because it's a packed theater and we want to see the end of this fucking movie. So the reason why I tell that story is because I feel that we are better at creating area of effect fear, basically. The type of folks that are culturally dominant, in order to create additional fear based off of what their reactions are going to be to the thing. And to kind of pick up on that point, I would like to ask you, well, what advice do you have for marginalized folks who are like writing seriously for the first time, who are just trying to get into it and want to make it a more serious type of thing?
I would say that the most important thing to do is start writing. I know that that's really annoying as advice, and it sounds so basic, but literally all you can do is start. Once you start writing, once you've written something, you can then look at it and be like, where do I need to improve? What do I need to edit? What do I need to change? But until you do that, you can't do anything. Something that's finished, or even something that's started, is always going to be better than like the perfect thing that's in your head. So yeah, just start writing. Even if you don't have like a particular story idea, or you like have character and story ideas that come to you and then flit away, one thing that I find is really useful is like free writing in an open space. So if you just go somewhere in public, like a coffee shop or something, literally just write everything down. Don't stop. Don't take your fingers off the keyboard or put your pen down. Just write everything you see, everything that comes into your head, whether it's descriptions of people, whether it's feelings you were feeling, smells, sensations, whether it is a story. Just write your entire train of thought down and just do that for like 5-10 minutes, set a timer and just keep doing it and don't let yourself stop. Then you can go back through that and be like, okay, what's here that I want to build on? What's here that I want to write? That's a really useful exercise for sort of getting the floodgates open, and starting to get your brain on a path of like thinking creatively and holding a creative thought.
Thank you for giving me that advice. So, a bit more of a specific question. I know that disability representation in writing is rare, and I know that good disability representation in writing is even rarer. What type of challenges do you face in writing disabled characters?
So for me, I think the disabled label is a little bit complicated. I am disabled. I just not hate admitting it, but hate acknowledging it in any way. I've got arthritis, I'm autistic, and I've got an injury to my hip because of the connective tissue problems that like I regularly strain, and then I regularly should use a cane or just rest. I frequently don't do either, which I don't recommend. And I'm also asthmatic. So none of these are like a sort of like really severe disabilities for me, and they're frequently disabilities that I try to ignore, even though it makes me very sick to do so. I think that for writing disabled characters, I write characters that are disabled in similar ways to how I am, and I also write characters who are disabled in different ways. I think that one of the hardest things about doing that is the sort of need to explain all the time. Just existing as an openly or visible disabled person, it makes people respond to you with basically feelings of like anxiety, and basically a desire not to see you. If I'm out with a cane and I'm using a cane, people will be uncomfortable, and often people will ask questions about the cane, or they'll comment on the cane, because I think that so many people are really used to the idea that disabled people aren't people that they should see out in public, and if they do see us out in public, we should be so cared for somebody else, or in the responsibility of a carer, that we shouldn't impact them in any way. We shouldn't be talking to them. Able people really need to fucking unpack that shit. And it obviously affects friends of mine like who use wheelchairs and who use other mobility aids like Zimmer frames far more than it does me. But even I get some of it like while using a cane. And like sometimes I'll stop to like use my inhaler in public and like people will come up and be like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yes, I'm taking my medication. It's fine." But because they've only ever seen like the joke asthmatic character in a TV show who's, dying immediately as soon as they have any sign of asthma, when like these are preventative medications, we take them so that we don't necessarily get that far. That's hard. I mean, it's a trauma, isn't it, of being disabled, and having existed in public as a disabled person. That's what impacts your writing when you're writing about it. I think the other thing is like that sense of needing to explain in the text, the way that you do when people talk to you about it in public. I also think that for me, there's a sense of I really try not to get too focused on the idea of like the responsibility of my work, not in the sense that I don't take responsibility for like potentially harming people and writing as sensitively as possible, but in the sense of like I really don't want to write purely as like a public good. I think that for art to be good and meaningful, I think it's really important for us to be writing from our own perspectives. And while this can be influenced and changed by the way that it'll be publicly perceived, when we get too focused in like what every possible audience will think of it and how they'll respond to it, that can mean we basically end up making Marvel movies. You're making bullshit for an audience that's as inoffensive or as bland as possible, and you end up creating work that's ultimately without meaning because it tries to have all of the meaning to too many kinds of people or too many people. When writing disability, so many people think of disability as like its own theme, if something's like in the disabled genre, rather than thinking of disability as a part of a person's character and part of their life and the lives of those around them. And obviously people think of other marginalized identities in the same way. They think of, not being white in the same way. They think of, not being Christian, basically, white Christian in the same way, not being straight in the same way. All of these things become like the genre to which that character belongs, because exploring something that's outside of like the mainstream assumption of what a normal person is then made into its own genre fiction. I find that difficult sometimes, especially when my work leaves what I would say is my target audience, which is broadly like, gay, disabled, trans masks. That's the main people who read my work. But once it leaves those people and starts filtering into like, especially like non-disabled people, but especially like non-disabled people who are outside of queer and marginalized communities, I start getting like, "Oh, it's so sad," or "Oh, it's so interesting that you wrote about like a character using a cane, but also he fucks." And I'm like, "Yeah, man, we've always been fucking like that." That's always been a thing. It is that thing of going against the standard expectation of what disabled people are and allowed to do and how we're allowed to exist. Even when writing fantasy and science fiction, there's a sense of like, "Oh, am I allowed to write this? Will non-disabled people understand?" And like, it doesn't fucking matter. They don't understand anything anyway. It's better to write, by us and for us than the alternative. And ultimately, I think that people, when they do read from broader perspectives, they do end up learning from them, which isn't the goal. That's just a nice side effect for those people. But that's never. Who gives a shit?
So first, I do want to touch on something you said near the beginning, where it is that people tend to get very anxious about the way that disabled folks are visible in public when we are visibly disabled. And that has definitely been an experience with me. Something that I tend to foot stomp on fairly hard is that it is completely possible to be attractive to other people while disabled, and that it doesn't make us lesser to be disabled. Like, I've had people comment on like how well put together I am while using a cane, how basically attractive I am, and how I should not be as disabled as I am because of it, which is a really interesting point of view that people tend to have of I use interesting in like interesting derogatory, but where people are basically just like, "Oh, well, you're attractive, so you must not be really disabled. It's to the point where my daily cane, my beater cane, has questions $5, disability doesn't discriminate, and I know I'm too young, all on it as stickers. I want to give the shop a shout out, but I think that they are still on hiatus right now. But it's Hate Kill Repeat on Etsy. Absolutely phenomenal shop. But past that, I recently had my disability get better to the point where I don't always have to use a cane. It's only on bad pain days. And the amount of shift in the way that people treated me was ridiculous, because I started to get treated overall so much better, but also I started to get recognized as a person more while I was using my cane daily, which I started doing before I transitioned. I never had to deal with like stalking, etc. in person, and I didn't realize that that was because I wasn't being seen as a person. It just became a thing of when I stopped using my cane, oh, now I'm having people follow me on the street. Now I'm having people follow me down alleys, etc. And it is a really wild realization to have exactly how much being visibly disabled kind of depersonalizes you. Also, I need to say that, yeah, man, we always been fucking is one of the best lines I have ever heard. I need that on a sticker or on meme, something like that. I don't know. But it's absolutely phenomenal. Because, like, my experience as someone who is a sex worker, who gets around a lot, and who uses a cane, who's disabled, is that it is usually less of a problem for most folks than they think it is, especially, like, as someone who is more dominant leaning. I don't really find that my cane gets in the way of doing that. However, I will have people fetishize the cane, which is really weird. But, like, because it's just a whole sidebar of medical fetishism of the not fun kind. However, I also, like, I'm a sexual person, even though I'm asexual. I exist sexually outside of my disability, and yeah, we be fucking. All right, so outside of that, my next question for you is, when was the first time that you saw your disabilities represented outside of your own writing, and how did that impact how you write, if at all?
I don't know. So I had asthma when I was a small child, and stopped using an inhaler, and then sort of during the pandemic, I had an awful sinus infection that brought my asthma back into needing to be medicated regularly, and I think I injured my hip the first time when I was about like 18 or 19. So yeah, I think that, funny enough, I actually had seen characters with disabilities like mine before that. And I just had a new relationship with them as I became more disabled, and will as you know as I become even more disabled and my arthritis gets worse. All of the examples I can think of are so garbage. I love House MD. I I know he's bad. House MD is so, I know he's bad. I know it's really awful, but like the thing is that he's so autistic and he's so queer, and the chronic pain stuff is such a mood. It's really interesting thinking of like Gregory House as like a model. I've got essays about this that are sort of in the process of being written, which people keep being like, have you written them yet? And I'm like, no, I'm just thinking about them a lot. But like, House MD is such an interesting TV show because it really hits so many of the points for being disabled, by a writer's room who didn't know what they were fucking doing. They didn't know they were doing that. The fact that Gregory House is so autistic, and frequently it's brought up by other characters, and they're like, oh, he acts like he's autistic, but he's not really autistic, he's just an asshole. And it's like, newsflash, guys, he's both. But also the fact that, like, the way that show deals with pain and the difficulty of being in pain, and the fact that nobody in his fucking life believes how important it is that he's in pain all the time, or the extent to which it actually disables him. So many people in that show are just uncomfortable with the fact that House is disabled, and they don't want House to be disabled in front of them. And it has nothing to do with House's quality of life, even though they talk about his quality of life. It has everything to do with the fact that it makes them uncomfortable to acknowledge the fact that their friend or their co-worker who sucks is disabled, and that it impacts his life in ways that they can't understand and won't understand. Especially because so much of that show is based in the US's war on drugs, and their horror of addiction. And I have to say, I'm firmly in the camp of believing that addiction should be acknowledged within the social model of disability. Addiction is disabling. It is, just straight up. And subsequently, when you see those three vectors combined, House's neurodivergence, House's physical disability and chronic pain, and also House's addiction and his addictive qualities, all of these factors add up to the fact that those around him and in his life, whether they're his co-workers, whether they're his best friends, whether they're his girlfriend/fiance, whether they're his own parents, all of those people in different ways traumatize him in different ways. All of them, whether they admit it or not, don't believe in the sanctity of House's bodily autonomy. And so much of his attitude in that show, and the way that he acts out to people, and the way that he responds to, basically the way he fucking bullies other members of the same or different marginalised communities, but also the way that he responds to other people's, desire for bodily autonomy. A lot of that is a trauma response, and is basically him doing what's been done to him. It's really interesting seeing that narrative play out, especially when, time and time again we see House interacting with people who are mentally ill, who are autistic, children particularly, people who are disabled in different ways, and every single time he's like, listen, nobody else is going to give you a choice. I'm going to talk to you. I just really like what so much of that show has to say on things like quality of life and what that means, and what that means when the words quality of life are only ever uttered by people who, without realizing, really are taken in by eugenicist ideology. The way that House talks about it is so different to other people on the show who talk about quality of life, and they only talk about it in the theory. They talk about it in the theory of, what if I became disabled? Wouldn't I want to kill myself? Because isn't it an awful, ugly thing to be disabled? Whereas House is a disabled man, and is someone who has that experience. And he's going, what do you think? No, don't tell me that you want to live for your family. What do you think? What's going to be good for you? And there's so much there, and it's so interesting. And it does so much with those themes, basically with the writers not even realising what they're doing sometimes. And I fucking dig that shit. Other characters, Long John Silver, but especially the Treasure Planet version. I love a hot old disabled pirate. Captain Hook is my guy. Again, hot disabled pirate. He's gay. What else do you need? Yeah. I hate that my examples are Long John Silver, Captain Hook, and House MD, but what can you do?
That's super fair, and I think that kind of goes back to the point of how rare disability representation is in general. Even not even touching on good disability representation, but just disability representation in general. Because there is so much that could be done with disability in stories. There are so many diverse stories that could be told using our disabilities as a focus, a narrative driver, and the way that it affects us. But also, you don't necessarily fucking have to. You could just have a guy who's fucking disabled, and yes, it's going to affect everything he does, but actually being able to have narrative complexity there of, yeah, there's a guy who's disabled, and he's also a fucking asshole. And not every disabled person is going to be so sweet and just so innocent, etc. type bullshit. We're complex people. We are allowed to be not just a stereotype of disability, we're allowed to be more than what people want to pity us as. And it's fucking ridiculous. So you write characters that are low to nonverbal. Do you feel like these types of characters get avoided due to the perceived challenges or complexities of writing them?
That's an interesting question because no, I don't. However, I don't think they're being written often in a way that is kind to them. I think that part of the reason that I'm so drawn to like low and non-verbal people as characters in fiction, and also part of the reason that I so love like flat affects, people who have like the classical autistic flat affect, like quite atonal when they speak, um, and often like expressionless or only having like micro expressions rather than like full expressions or whatever that means. Quite a lot of my family had those flat affects and were quite atonal growing up, and I always associated it with like comfort and home. It never upset me, it never bothered me. And subsequently I'd see a lot of these characters, and I'm using these terms interchangeably, not because they're always the same, but because both of them go towards coding a character as autistic, often without actually calling them autistic. So people would write these fucking characters who are really flat affect, or who are like almost nonverbal, or who don't speak at all, and or like only speak in like certain environments, like especially people who are really shy, and they wouldn't admit that they're autistic. They'd give them all these autistic traits so that other characters would bully them over it. I think that people frequently write characters like this, but they almost always do it as like the butt of a joke. Like one of the big examples I would say is Raj in Big Bang Theory, who is a character I the thing is, right, Big Bang Theory is a very bad show, but I really like. I was gonna say I like all the characters. That's not actually true. I think I like Sheldon, I like Raj, and I like Penny, and then the other ones I'm like, you don't really need to be here. But what's really interesting to me about that show is that this is a show about how it's okay to bully autistic people because they're so autistic, and how like it's awful. It's so based in like a moral ugliness, which I really don't. Oh God, but a character like Raj, who, is in the Big Bang Theory, and this sort of character sort of appeals a lot. The idea that he in some situations, in his case, being around women, gets so anxious that he can't speak is laughable to so many people, and it's because anxiety is laughable, and it's because not being able to speak is laughable because it's someone who doesn't have power in a certain situation. And a lot of non-disabled people, when they interact with that sort of disability, and they're not viewing it as disability, they're only viewing it as like a vulnerability, and therefore not something that's worthy of special respect. They immediately think, cool, weakness, I want to exploit it, I want to hurt that person, I want to publicly humiliate that person, because they're soulless, they're awful people. And then there's other TV shows, and other movies where that sort of like selective mutism, or just generally like being non-verbal or being little verbal is seen as like mysterious, and magical. And like, okay, like I get you, but also like I know people who just fucking barely speak, and when they do speak, it's devastating. Especially this idea that like, someone who doesn't speak, and when they do speak, they're so nice. Listen, I have men and women in my life, and non-binary people too. I have so many of these people who barely speak, and then when they speak, they say the cuntiest fucking thing. And it's so good, and it's so funny, and it's really sharp and so incisive. I think that a lot of people who, and I say this as someone who sort of fucking talks all the time. I really struggle to not talk, because of anxiety, but also because I'm just a chatty guy, and I really love, as someone who's very talkative, being around people who are much less so, and those interactions, and the way that our different communication styles sort of complement each other and intersect, and interlace. But yeah, one thing that I really don't like, and a thing that really bothers me, it's not about like a character who's mystical or mysterious who doesn't speak much, but it's this idea of like someone is mystical and mysterious and they don't speak because it's like a curse or whatever. or someone who is shy and who can't get over it. And this idea of desiring to cure that person and get rid of it. Because that ultimately is what it comes down to. Even shit like autistic traits and the flat affect, the idea that like these are just a curse. Those are just rehashing changeling myths of seeing autistic people and being like, that's not a human being, that's a fairy changeling. That's all that is. It's a rehash of that trope. And it really bothers me because, you know, because I have so many positive interactions with these people, and so many of these people are in my life, and I love them so much. And I also like, you know, these autistic people, or whether they're autistic or not, because there's so many of them in my life, in my family, and in my social circles. And then people are sort of like, oh, we should cure them. And I'm like, cure them of what? Like being fucking the best? Like, why? And knowing it's just sort of based in ableism, and a desire for social homogeny, and making everybody the same, and making everybody as easy to interact with as possible, by making everyone identical. That attitude is the same toward me. They just don't know that it's the same as toward me. But my autistic traits are also things that they would like to get rid of. It's just that I might be better at masking them, or they might not notice them because my traits are like more ADHD and more associated with performance. But it's the same thing. Like someone who wants to cure a flat affect person would also want to cure me. They just want to cure us of like the same traits that we both have, but that they can't see in me or don't notice in me because I talk so much. So, you know, it's fucking personal. But even if it wasn't about me, like, obviously I'd still fucking care. Yeah, it's complicated and it's thorny. But I really love big varieties in speech and language, the different ways in which people express themselves, whether that's in speech, whether that's in sign languages, whether it's in body language, whether it's via other methods entirely. The diversity of that from person to person, and the unique ways in which people express themselves and don't express themselves, endlessly fascinating to me. Fucking love that shit.
I really love that shit too, because it's like everyone has such a variety of things to say and or not say, or things to communicate in like body language, etc. All this wide variety of communication that people want it to just all be boiled down to the easy, the verbal, and it's like, why? There are so many stories to be told. There are so many different ways to tell these stories. Part of that comes from my experience growing up as a dancer, where you don't get to use your voice very often. Like, it is very rare that you're going to be saying any words when you're dancing. So you are trying to tell this entire story entirely through movement, entirely through your body. And so many people don't fully get it or don't translate it properly, and it's so frustrating. With folks who are low to nonverbal, they are telling a whole fucking story there, you just aren't picking up on it. But yeah, that is my general point of view on that. All right, so we are on to our last question. So you write sex work as a recurring theme in a lot of your work. How do you feel that your experience as a sex worker has influenced the way that you write about it?
So I did sex work, phone sex work for a few years, and then when I was younger, it wasn't sex work, but it wasn't not sex work. Let's not talk about that. The phone sex work, bearing in mind that that's there as a foundation, and then the phone sex work. So I was a phone sex operator for about 2 years, and quite a lot of my social circle have either also done phone sex work, although I think I'm mostly like the only one. The people that have done it have only done it like incidentally, or they did like cam work, which is slightly different. And then I have other friends, a lot of friends who have done a lot of like full service sex work or different forms of sex work. I think that to write about being transgender and being disabled and being queer, in many ways these themes cross over with writing about sex work. Because so many of us are in different ways not employable or not marketable to general society in terms of jobs, whether that's because of our appearance, whether it's because of our social differences, our lack of ability to measure certain social cues. In my case, a lot of like fatigue and difficulty with focusing on paperwork or a non-verbal job, and also like needing the variety. All of these factors, the things that make us employable in other ways, mean that we might be more fit for sex work in terms of skill than other things, because sex work is such a social thing, because so much of it is about judging other people's cues and knowing bodies, and the limitations of a body, the weaknesses of a body, but also the strengths of a body, and also just the fact that mainstream employers often don't want to employ us. I'm very lucky compared to a lot of people, because of the different ways in which I'm not visibly what I am, or the way that people want to look past what I am, because they're like, oh, well, he's kooky, because I'm white and thin and handsome, so they're like, oh, it's fine. Christ. Yeah, so I think to write about sex work a lot of the time is also to write about the intersecting themes of disability and queerness and transness, because in so many ways they intersect and they cross over. I also think that one of the things that sex work has in common with those is again that idea of the multiplicity of self, that idea that this is a different face that you wear and a different personality that you wear in certain situations, and the way that those things can morph, the way that we can change our presentations and change our apparent personalities, change the way we speak, all based off of like the small cues of the other person.
So I do want to touch on what you were talking about how sex work and being trans, being disabled, being queer, all kind of ties in together and crosses over. Because like part of the reason with Transpire Media that I started it, one of the things that I really wanted to do was to make sure to focus people who either currently are or were sex workers, because I feel like very often that gets cut out of our story for palatability reasons. Like we will talk about people and we will talk about, oh, they did all this stuff, especially if they were some of our like heroes, whatever. We will talk about how, oh yeah, they did all this stuff, they were a community leader, and we'll completely ignore the fact that they were also a sex worker of some kind. Because so much of what we need to do is to survive. For example, I've been a sex worker for a little while now, because I was out of work for 6 months. And I started doing like OnlyFans work as a supplemental income to the little bit of other income that I had coming in while I was unemployed. I had been doing sex work before that as burlesque, because it gave me a way to still dance even through being disabled, which I'm now learning there's potentially even more ways for me to do that, but that's a whole other story. But I really just... it's very important to me that the story of sex work, in both the large and small ways it affects our lives, gets properly addressed, with not addressed as in it's a bad thing, but properly addressed as in not shoved under the rug, so that we can actually fucking talk about this shit.
So much of sex work of different descriptions is about measuring up the other person, the client, or occasionally other sex workers, but broadly clients, and finding in them what they want, and finding what they crave, and then giving it to them, although not necessarily right away, often like withholding it and then giving it to them in order to draw out an interaction. It's the same thing that salespeople do. It's the same thing that that mediums do, and other con artists do. It's the same thing that some church leaders do. These are interpersonal skills, but they're also skills in cold reading, in hot reading, and also in noticing like really small social cues, but also pattern recognition and profiling. I'm not saying that what sex workers do is like the same as what the FBI does, because they don't write it down and call it science. But like a lot of it is the same thing. And the thing is that like when you're looking for like small patterns in other people, and you recognize those patterns, it can be really useful when you're then sort of selling them something, or when you're then trying to find a need in them that needs to be fulfilled. And the thing is that, like, I think another reason that so many of us are good at doing that when we then go into sex work is because these are survival skills that we have to use to stay alive in a society that hates us and wants to eradicate us. You know, many people who enter sex work have already experienced the process of basically trying to convince others, no, you don't want me dead, you don't hate me, or at least not enough to kill me, because I can still give you things that you want. I can still make you feel needed. I can still fulfill needs that you have. And a lot of sex work is to do with those skills. It's basically, you know, playing on people's needs, but also playing on what is often like their quote-unquote natural revulsion for you, where they've been taught to hate you because they want the services that you're giving them, but also they hate that you exist because that's what society has told them to do. And they hate themselves for not being able to get those services like the normal way or whatever. See, a lot of what I've just said, I think, makes me sound quite cynical about sex work, and like I didn't enjoy it, but I really, really enjoyed doing it while I was doing it. The only reason that I stopped when I moved to a new apartment was because I had laminate floors, and subsequently, like, when I was on the phone, you could hear it through the entire house and downstairs, like in the other apartment too, and I was like not about it. But the thing, and the thing is, like, you know, increasingly, like, there's a movement away from sex work, as there's a movement more toward cam work. I love sex work over the phone. I think that phone sex, and not just dirty talk, but the interaction that you have over the phone, because it's faceless and because it's purely based in the voice, there's so much capacity for like illusion and connection that feels anonymous in a way that cam work can't. Because you're both creating an illusion together, and you're creating a shared world in a way that you can do over text, but but I think it's more visceral than that because it's based in voice and sound also. And I love that, because I love magic, right? Like, I love like magic performances and sleight of hand and shit like that. And I really like movie effects, and how a lot of movie effects are based in illusion. So the, you know, Foley artists, the people that make sound for movies, so much of the sound that you hear in movies isn't, you're hearing it, but like you hear a horse hooves, and what you're actually hearing is like coconut halves being clocked together, or you think that you're hearing like an electronic door like whooshing open, and it's a paper coming out of an envelope being held close to the microphone. Phone sex, same stuff. Listen, the number of times that I like slapped my thigh, as if, yeah, and you know what the guy on the other hand heard was I was spanking myself, and like I was, but like I wasn't doing it very hard. I just knew how to like put my hand in the right place and on like the broadest part of my thigh, so it made a loud noise, so it sounds like I'm hitting myself really hard. No, I'm fucking not. I'm not doing that. You know, I'm not going to that amount of effort. And like, you know, like wet sounds, you know, like, oh, I'm touching myself. I'm like, no, I'm moving my tongue like on the side of my mouth, so it sounds like I'm fingering myself and I'm holding the phone like close to my cunt. You know, shit like that. That's so much fun to do. And there's a level of control and intrigue, I think, that's there in the control of your voice, and the interaction that you're having with the other person, a level of intimacy there. And it was interesting, and it was varied, and I really liked the levels of social connection. I think that one thing that I think comes off in my work, and the number of characters that I write, is the same thing that I loved about doing phone sex work, is that no two people were ever the same. That I was constantly talking to new and very different people, which I fucking love. No matter where I am, I love talking to new people and learning about different individual people. Cultures, yes, but I specifically mean like a new person and their individual things. Endless fun for me. And I think that sex work, and especially as a phone sex worker, although before then too, really allowed for that in a interesting way. Yeah. I think that because sex work is so so misunderstood by so many people in the society we live in, and not respected and not viewed as viewed as dirty and degenerate, but also like not viewed as like inherently interesting, unless it's titillating, is such a shame, because like so much of sex work is dangerous. Phone sex work is one of the few where like you're pretty much, I would say, is the safest form of sex work almost. It's so much safer than meeting someone face to face, and they don't even necessarily have your face like they do with cam work, and they can't necessarily track you like they can with cam work. But like sex work itself, I always loved doing in different forms, even when it wasn't that safe, for me, when it wasn't phone sex, and a lot of that is to do with the different ways people are. I think that comes back to like the fear of the unknown, and also like a general fear of sex in society and intimacy. I went off, but
Listen, going off is completely fine too, because like everything that you had to say was phenomenal, and I really enjoyed listening to all of it. You had a lot of really, really good points. That is about the end of what we have for today. However, I do want to highlight that you can find Johannes on Twitter and Tumblr under Johannes T Evans, and also on their Patreon as Johannes Evans, and on Medium as Johannes T Evans as well. Thank you so much for being with us today, and can't wait to see you next time.